Have you heard of Thomas Aquinas? He's a famous scholastic theologian, one of the greatest of all time, I think most would argue, but he has significant differences in his theology, structure, and doctrine than that of Protestant churches. Yet Protestants today are becoming more and more interested in the theology of Thomas Aquinas. Today I'm joined by Dr. John Hoyam to talk about the differences between Protestant theology, more specifically in our case, Lutheran theology, and that of Thomas Aquinas, and maybe talk about why Protestants get interested in Aquinas or to what degree he is or isn't useful for Protestants. So, John, just for people who maybe have heard of Aquinas but don't know much about him, who was Thomas Aquinas?
Yeah, Aquinas is a 13th century Dominican friar. He's a theologian. He teaches, if I'm not mistaken, in Paris, and he's the author of a couple of important works, very large works of theology and philosophy, the Summa Theologica and the Summa Contra Gentiles. And in those books, he lays out kind of a systematic account of an answer to the question, what is Christianity?
What is attractive about Aquinas today? We see this a lot. I mean, we even participate in it, where you go back in the past to a great teacher of the faith and sort of bring their lessons forward. People would be familiar with 1517, doing this a lot with Luther, for instance. What's the appeal of Aquinas?
Yeah, the appeal of Aquinas is something I think we can relate to in the sense that the Reformation itself was a return to the source of all human knowledge and learning, which of course we find in the scriptures and in classical antiquity of Greece and Rome. This is something that actually spurred on the Reformation itself. And what Aquinas does is something similar, but with a twist, and that's where the critique is going to come in. Aquinas is basically involved in this grand synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy, which has been brought to Western Europe by Islamic traders and scholars who have come in contact with Western Europe. So he is sort of part of this renaissance of Aristotle's philosophy. And what he does is he takes this philosophical outlook and integrates it with biblical Christianity, essentially. And it's a little bit of an oversimplification to say that Aquinas is just synthesizing or mixing or melding Aristotle's philosophy and biblical faith, but that's kind of his project in a nutshell.
So Aquinas gives an overview of all of the doctrines of Christianity, sort of attempts to demonstrate how they would be interconnected or what the flow between these are, and is sometimes, described as giving us this relationship or pointing out the relationship between grace and nature, for instance, which is where a lot of the detraction with Protestant theology can come down to as well. What are the major doctrines where Protestants, specifically in our case, Lutherans, differ from Aquinas that makes maybe, you certainly should encourage people to read Aquinas, but to utilize or to adopt his systematic frameworks in Protestant theology?
Yeah, I think the main kind of idea that is behind a lot of the specific doctrinal differences that Lutherans and other Reformation Christians are going to have with Aquinas is the idea of nature and grace, as you mentioned. This is a phrase often attributed to St. Augustine that's common in medieval Western theology, that grace does not destroy but perfects nature. What this means is that there is some vestige of goodness in creation, which in a way, of course, we can affirm. We believe that God's creation is good, it's marred by sin. But the important thing for Aquinas is that God has material to work with in the creation despite sin. And this influences the way that Aquinas and many other medieval scholastic theologians think about particularly salvation. So if God has material to work with, if there is some amount of human freedom, for example, when we talk about salvation, God is not dealing with a sinner who is dead, but a sinner who is sick and needs to be made well again. You're not dealing with a sinner who is entirely incapable of acting towards goodness, but a sinner who needs help acting towards goodness or towards God himself. And so what this affects is various doctrines, the sacraments, but I think chiefly justification, which is that for Aquinas, he would not be able to say that justification, the declaration of righteousness, is on account of faith in Christ alone. Rather, justification, as all Roman Catholic theology since the Council of Trent has said, that of course was in the 16th century, but it kind of codifies what a lot of medieval theologians were teaching about justification, was that justification is by grace and human works or human merit. And so there is a non-competition, there is a collaboration, a synergy between human work and divine work in salvation, which means that without me, without my will, without my action, my salvation is impossible. I have to contribute something. And so this is a doctrinal point upon which Aquinas' view of the relationship between nature and grace gets him on the wrong side of the Reformation.
Yeah, grace, sort of, especially for Lutherans, but on Reformation terms, Melanchthon helps reorient the definition back towards a biblical one of it being an attitude on the part of God rather than a substance which is infused to a creature in order to empower or something like this, or a power that can be grasped in order to start acting with God or in accordance with God and something like that. And so you will hear sometimes Roman Catholics today or fans of Aquinas today say like that they can affirm that salvation is by grace alone because God dispenses grace and then that grace is used by the creature in the salvific effort. But this is, obviously contradictory to the way the Protestants confess the faith, specifically with the sola scriptura in the background. The question then is, if it's so obvious, if it's like on essential things like grace and justification, that Aquinas is thoroughly Roman Catholic, and thus sort of the rejection and the anathema of the doctrines and error in Rome from Protestants still stand or still work against Aquinas or are working against Aquinas. What is it about Aquinas that seems recoverable by Protestants, or can you shift where this happens? So I've seen it or heard it that he got grace wrong in terms of justification, but if we shift Aquinas's perspective on grace to sanctification in the Christian life after justification, we're safe. We can utilize Aquinas for encouraging people in their Christian life.
You said to keep these brief. I feel like I could go on and on with that prompt, Caleb. A couple of things. You and I have been talking about this for years, that a lot of the kind of Protestant Thomism is a shifting of the goalposts, which is to say, as long as I maintain that justification is a declaration of righteousness, I can do whatever I want in the realm of sanctification as far as synergism is concerned, as far as the cooperation or collaboration between God and the human. And so you can kind of maintain this grand metaphysical architecture of what theologians will kind of technically call participation, as long as you maintain justification as a forensic declaration. That is, it's just a pronouncement of righteousness, and then everything else can operate on this synergistic participation model in which the human will is required to be active and collaborative with God. The worst instance of this, Caleb, as you know, is in post-Reformation Calvinism, where a distinction ends up being made between the declaration of righteousness, that is justification, that verdict, and the attainment of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
So once you make this distinction between the declaration of righteousness and the attainment of heaven as our active, collaborative, synergistic participation in the good, then my assurance of heaven has now been transferred from Christ and his blood shed for me to Christ and his blood plus my own good works. That's an area where Protestants, I think, believe that they can reintegrate this view of nature and grace, of participation, and that there are other positive payouts elsewhere in doctrine. We can talk about those, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, it seems like that the sort of the reality of the simul, or say that, your works are imperfect in this life, for instance, then is used to create space to say, well, then we can apply this sort of grace thing. How would we get the works to be more perfect? Or how could I make progress in having more of my works be good? It would be by receiving some sort of infusion of grace, or being under God's grace, or being in his presence of his mercy and love and things like this more and more, right? And so you can then sort of add a religious life component to this that might be perceived as absent from Lutheranism in general or Protestantism in general. And then you can attempt to recover something from before the Reformation too. I think sometimes as an attempt to justify the Reformation's continuity with the older church to Roman Catholics as part of like an apologetic or a debate with Roman Catholics as well. I think that's some of it is that there are some Protestants who end up debating Catholics who do feel convicted or don't really feel strong in an answer that they know they're supposed to give about the Reformation, which is the Reformation is not just one isolated event in the history of church. It's continuing truth forward. And so then in order to do that with a clean conscience, I think people try to recover a little bit too much from places like Aquinas in terms of sanctification and things like that. But especially for us Lutherans, I mean, I think you would agree, sanctification is discussed in our confessions very briefly, and is always attributed as a work of God, first starting in the catechisms and then affirmed in the Book of Concord, that sanctification is done to us in an order after justification, by faith, but that it is a result of that. It is not a result of works. And that actually is part of that order. The works follow sanctification. Sanctification does not follow works. So Protestants have, and especially Lutherans, have been confessing that if they hold to the Lutheran confessions, and it doesn't really leave any room for Aquinas.
I certainly would agree. I think that when it comes to the issue of sanctification, the best and briefest way to think about the life of the Christian and good works is that Christ is the one doing all the good works in your life, and you are the one doing all the sin. And of course, they're mingled together and difficult to pull apart from each other when you, say, engage in self-examination. But there is a clean division between what belongs to Christ, which includes all your good works, and what belongs to you. And I don't think in Aquinas's view of things, he's really able to affirm what we would call the simul, the idea that we are at the same time justified and sinful, totally and completely. He's thinking more with somebody like St. Augustine, who we love and appreciate and affirm on many, if not most things, but was not quite able to get outside of this concept of sanctification as a sliding scale of partial sin and partial righteousness, in which one can become more and less righteous or sinful and so on. So Aquinas is very much working in that framework. And again, it goes back to these kind of basic presuppositions, which in some ways are inheritances of antique Greco-Roman philosophy, that's all created being participates to one degree or another in the divine being, which is goodness itself. And so there's simply no room for an absolute distinction between law and gospel, between old creation and new creation, between the sinner and the righteous.
Well, that's excellent, John. Thanks for doing this short video. We have a full-length podcast where we talked about Aquinas and sort of where Lutherans ought to disagree with Aquinas. That's on the Thinking Fellows podcast. You can find that on YouTube. You can also subscribe to it in your favorite podcasting apps. We hope you enjoyed this show. Subscribe to the 1517 channel for more videos like this. We will catch you next time.